Well, the two leaders are the center of the brutal civil war in South Sudan, which has plunged the world's youngest nation into humanitarian crisis, have met face-to-face for peace talks for the first time in several years. South Sudan's President Salva Kiir met Wednesday night with his former Vice President Riek Machar, who leads the country's main opposition forces in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Wednesday was characterized by hugs and handshakes, but the main question is, will this gesture bring a lasting peace to South Sudan? This is Bottom Line Africa. Tonight, I'll be speaking to John Gashie actually. He's a regional affairs analyst. And joining me from Berlin, Germany, via Skype is Peter Biora-Jack, who's the chairman of the South Sudan Young Leaders Forum and founder of the Center for Strategic Analysis in Juba. Once again, this is Bottom Line Africa. My name is Yusuf Ibrahim. Let me take you straight to our headlines tonight. Heads of state and government from Eyad trooped to Addis to pile pressure towards a peaceful settlement to South Sudan's political crisis.
Museveni is such a reckless patriarch, such a misogynist, such an abuser and hater of women.
Tonight, we'll tell you why Ugandan academic turned activist will not shy away from criticizing Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni. And the World Cup unites Africa, even as 2 of the 5 teams representing the continent are technically out of the tournament. Also tonight, meet a Libyan man who has turned part of his Tripoli home to a shelter for injured and starving stray cats. Good evening, Africa. Once again, the program begins right now. On our Twitter poll tonight, we are asking you, are you optimistic that South Sudan leaders are ready to embrace peace? Are you optimistic that South Sudan leaders are ready to embrace peace? This is the first time they're meeting in, I think 2-3 years. That is Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir. They're meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Of course, President Uhuru Kenyatta is also there. So we are asking you, do you think or are you optimistic that South Sudan leaders are ready to embrace peace? Our Twitter handle is at KTN News. You can as well tweet me at Yusuf Ibra. The hashtag to use as always is Bottom Line Africa. Now, let me begin with that top story for you. An Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, last night hosted a private dinner for the 2 South Sudanese protagonists, that is President Salva Kiir and his former deputy, Dr. Riek Machar, together. Now, the two met for the first time in 5 years. In a Twitter poll, post Abiy said, faced with continued suffering in South Sudan, Ethiopia simply can't stand by. He added that with more work, a peaceful future is possible in South Sudan. In a statement, the SPLM-IO said the best way to achieve lasting peace is to address the deep-seated root causes to the conflict in the country. The Machar-led movement has requested for more time to establish goodwill. The last deal signed in August 2015 collapsed less than a year later, with both sides accused of violating the terms of a ceasefire and carrying out human rights abuses like massacres and rapes. The United Nations, US and the African Union have all threatened punitive measures if the fighting does not stop by the end of this month.
Eyad has decided to call face-to-face dialogue between our President, Salva Kiir Mayardit, and Riek Machar on the outstanding issues. I think this will take place today as scheduled on the 20th, and the summit will be tomorrow. Before the summit, there will be a Council of Ministers of Eyad. We had been discussing the issue of security. We have differences on the time frame. The opposition are talking about 12 to 18 months, and the government is talking about 120 days for integration of the forces. And if we take the period that has been suggested by opposition, it is just the same like what has happened last time. Is initially going to 2 armies, and we cannot afford to have 2 armies in South Sudan.
That is the latest we have for you from Addis Ababa. There you go. You've seen the hugs, the handshakes, and that is why we did ask you if you are optimistic that South Sudan leaders are ready to embrace peace finally. And it's good to point out that today During their talks in Addis Ababa, we received very scanty information. Of course, that is going to form part of our discussion tonight. But for now, let's take a look at the chronology of key events leading up to today's meeting. We're going to get those infographics shortly for you on the screen. There you go. In 2011, that is 9th July, independence was declared following a referendum. Then 2011 to 2013, several people were killed in ethnic clashes in different states as tension built up then. And then on 2011, 9th July, Sudan and South Sudan agreed to resume pumping oil after bitter dispute over fees that saw production shut down more than a year earlier. They also agreed to withdraw troops from their border area to create a demilitarized zone. And then on July 2013, President Salva Kiir dismissed his entire cabinet and Vice President Riek Machar in a power struggle within the governing Sudan People's Liberation Movement. And then still, that same year, that is 2013, this time around in December, civil war erupted as President Salva Kiir accused his deputy then, Riek Machar, of plotting to overthrow him. Rebel factions seized control of several regional towns. And then the next year, the following year, 2014, January, a ceasefire was signed but broken several times over subsequent weeks. And then in 2016, April, Riek Machar finally returned to Juba and was sworn in as a first vice president in a new unity government, but was sacked in July after further conflict and goes back into exile. Then in the same year, in December this time around, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights says a process of ethnic cleansing is underway in several parts of the country, a claim that President Salva Kiir denied then. Then in 2017, March, Machar left the East African territory to South Africa, and there he was placed under house arrest. Then on 27th May 2017, President Kiir declared unilateral ceasefire, launching national dialogue. And then, fast forward to 2018, June. This is where we are as far as the crisis in South Sudan or the talks, that is meant to arrive to peace there is concerned. Talks begin in Ethiopia as the two leaders are brought together in a bid to form a unity transitional government. Of course, those talks in Addis Ababa is what is going to form the basis of our discussion tonight. Once again, as I've already mentioned, we've received very scanty information out of Addis Ababa following yesterday's footage where we've seen that hugs and handshakes between those two leaders, that is Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. Now, trade ministers from the Eyad community have adopted a draft policy framework on informal cross-border trade and cross-border security governance in the Eyad region. The framework proposes important policy shifts in the conduct of informal cross-border trade in the Eyad region meant to improve cross-border security. Now, Eyad trade ministers were on a one-day summit in Mombasa.
Talking about trade and business, so Horn of Africa proves that there is relative peace. That is one. Two, all African countries have 15% component of informal trade at cross borders. We want to formalize that cross-border trade.
Eyad has been known for a very long time on dealing with security issues only. I think what we are doing today is to deal with another very important issue of cross-border trade and its linkage with cross-border securities that we have amongst the member states. And so all the ministers of trade who are here deliberated on the work that was produced by a committee of experts on what we need to do to deal with cross-border trade. The focus of this exercise has been on informal cross-border trade.
Oh, it is Thursday, and of course, before we begin our discussion with regards to the South Sudan crisis and the latest talks, that is still underway in the Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Over to our throwback soundbite for tonight, and it comes from former South Sudan Vice President Dr. Riek Machar in a famous address in London alongside the country's founding father, Dr. John Garang Dimabior. This address, delivered on the 2nd of March 2002, the leaders were pushing for the world to intervene in their war against the Khartoum regime. Let's listen in.
But are the issues of Sudan only international terrorism? We have the war in the south, which now has engulfed the whole country. There is lack of democracy. The people are being displaced from their own locations because the regime wants to exploit oil. So what do we do? My answer is, the regime must go. It's not negotiating that will make a change. We have tried. In that agreement, if it were serious, peace would have come. But it is not serious. But we have a big task to do. The world sees the struggle is united. One reason which this regime could have used. The struggle is now united.
Well, that was some time back. Now, fast forward to 2018, and the two leaders at the center of the brutal civil war in South Sudan, which has plunged the world's youngest nation into a humanitarian crisis, have met face-to-face for peace talks for the first time in several years. Now, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir met Wednesday, of course Thursday, with his former Vice President Riek Machar, who leads the country's main opposition forces in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Now, Wednesday was characterized by hugs and handshakes, but the main question is, will this gesture bring a lasting peace to the youngest nation in Africa? In studio, I'm with John Geshier, who is a regional affairs analyst, and joining me from Berlin, Germany is Peter Biorajak, who is the founder and director of the Center for Strategic Analysis in Juba. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thank you.
Before crossing over to Berlin, let me start with you, John. Of course, you are at our City Center studio. And let me begin with this. This is a situation that actually our Foreign Affairs editor, Lillian Odera, referred to as nails and pins kind of a situation. Do you believe with the latest talks in Addis, peace might, be achieved in South Sudan?
I would be cautiously optimistic. And at the same time, I will be realistically pessimistic. And I'll put it in this context that we've had, as you rightly told your viewers, that the South Sudan peace process has been one step forward and then 2 steps backwards, and possibly again another step forward and 3 steps sideways. And in the same situation, perhaps for me, is that the new thing is perhaps that they have met. And I think they more or less met because they each sought to use the meeting to deliver a particular message and also seek a particular leverage, and also, in my view, to send a message to their core supporters. Now, all the 2 parties have very different interests, and I am not so sure, unless perhaps we get the communique to know precisely what they agreed upon. And as we point out, it's taken nearly over 24 hours, and we still do not really know
what's exactly going on,
what the agreed, what is exactly going on. And as it is now, I get the feeling that perhaps we needed to be very careful that this would be the beginning of a very long and possibly full of twists and turns, as the two principals still want to use this meeting to perhaps send certain signals to their core supporters and also to the international community to try and create, in my view, that there is motion. And I am not convinced at the moment, but again, I could be wrong, and I only hope, like a lot of other South Sudanese and other people of goodwill, would hope that this would perhaps finally open the logjam and perhaps we would see
and bring a lasting peace in South Sudan. Yes, Gashie, I think you've delivered your point there. Let me bring Peter into this discussion. And Peter, I think you've heard John's point of view there, saying that, the talks on South Sudan, peace talks, is about, making one step forward and two steps backward. Let me begin with this. What's your view with this latest round of talks that is taking place in Addis?
Well, Yusuf, let me start by saying that this was something that we all expected. These are individuals who do not like each other very much. From those pictures, you can see that they are really being put together, Prime Minister, and they're not comfortable standing next to one another. Even before the meeting, we know very well that these individuals were not really going to make any progress. They were not really going to agree on it. So personally, my expectations were quite low before this meeting happened. And I think from what we are hearing so far, the discussion was very broad. There was nothing specific that was discussed. As you know very well, a few weeks ago, Eyad tabled a draft agreement that reduced the entire pool into distribution of power, which position will be taken by Machar and which position will be taken by Salva Kiir. And we know very well from the meeting that none of this was actually discussed. It was very broad, it was very vague, and nothing has been reached. And from what we are hearing from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who is now essentially threatening the two leaders, that if they don't agree to something, then the region may be forced to take some action. It's very clear that the leaders of South Sudan are not ready to make peace.
Yes. And now let me engage John once again. And John, you've seen the video that Peter is talking about, the handshake and the hugs that we witnessed yesterday, the footage that came out of Addis Ababa. I think that was the last kind of a picture we got from this latest round of talks. And you could see these two leaders were a bit kind of, not very comfortable in each other's presence. But this is a country whose economy has basically been demolished. We've seen, millions who've been displaced. Don't you think, John, it's about time that these two leaders bury their hatchet and develop their country?
You couldn't put it any better, but perhaps the issue is that they are still miles apart. And I think the core issues and their core supporters, and also individually, they still have not, in my view, as my colleague perhaps is pointing out, the body language was not there. The chemistry was not there. What I would call the heart of the matter is power sharing. And I do not, in my view, unless perhaps we get something much more fruitful, is that, as I said earlier, both parties and both principles were playing, in my view, to the gallery, and they were sending conflicting signals to their core supporters, but also trying to perhaps in a way tactfully try to deflect, as it were, the pressure that is quite building from the international community, specifically from Eyad, and also internally for them to, make peace, possible.
Yes.
And I still think that perhaps there is still more that is required in terms of diplomatic, economic, and indeed possibly even to a large extent sanctions. And for Eyad to keep up the pressure, as it were, to bring the two people to really commit. It's okay for them to meet. It's okay for them to perhaps meet and try and delay, in my view, and create a perception that they are interested in talks.
Yes.
But I do not, as it currently reported and what we have observed, I do not see that a watermark or a watershed has been made, and that both parties, as it were, and specifically in my view, the body language from President Salva Kiir was still fairly very guarded, and also still stuck that he was not willing to perhaps share, indeed, as it were, power with Riek Machar.
Yes.
For Dr. Riek Machar, on the other hand, I think this meeting for him is perhaps what I would say, what I would call a deja vu moment, that he is now not anymore within restrictions in South Africa, and that perhaps his participation has to a large extent been vindicated and has been given more, shall I say, impetus to push the peace process. But the media reports that we are getting is that Dr. Riek Machar has criticized the format in which the Eyad peace process has been ongoing. So does that perhaps then mean he's dissatisfied or would want a new format?
And John, actually,
and then we have also been made to understand.
Actually, there's a new statement by the Dr. Riek Machar's team, that is the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. I'm going to quote that shortly. But let me bring Peter into this discussion once again. And Peter, you've already talked about the uneasy handshake and hugs that we witnessed yesterday. Of course, pictures coming out of Addis Ababa Wednesday, that is last night. Apart from that, we've not had any kind of information whatsoever coming out of the talks that took place today. Perhaps can you tell us some of the contentious issues? What are some of the issues that these two leaders have never agreed upon?
Well, as I was telling you before, Eyad has reduced the peace agreement into a location of power between all the different parties that are fighting in the civil war in South Sudan. So the number one issue now is the issue of distribution of power. How do you distribute the power between the government and the different factions? Eyad proposed in the draft resolution that overall about 60% of the position would be given to the government, and then the Machar faction would get 25%. And this has not been agreed by both sides. Machar side has not agreed, and the government side has not agreed. So that is one issue. The other second issue is whether Machar will actually return to Juba, or whether his faction will be represented by somebody else other than Machar. This is a contentious issue because President Salva Kiir has made it very clear that he cannot work with Riek Machar. And I think everybody knows, the world knows now, that these two leaders, given the stage that the relationship has reached, they really are unable to reach and work together in a way to transform the networks and the incentives of conflicts that drive violence in South Sudan. So that is another issue. But broadly speaking, see, what Eyad and everybody else must understand is that these leaders of South Sudan, they are not interested to make peace at the moment. These talks that they are having, they are not really aimed genuinely at finding a solution to the crisis. It's really about deflecting tension from the international community that is putting pressure. And for Machar, the real driving interest for him was for him to be released from the house arrest that he was in South Africa. This meeting appeared as if it was his ticket out. But even at the moment, it's not clear. It seems like he may even head back again to South Africa to another round of detention. So it's completely unclear. But the bottom line is this. People of South Sudan are getting tired. The leaders of South Sudan don't seem at all to be interested in peace. And at the same time, the leaders of Eyad, they keep on releasing a statement that we are not going to tolerate, that we are going to put pressure, that we are going to put punitive action. But up to this moment, we have not seen anything. So it doesn't seem Eyad is even itself serious putting any kind of significant pressure on these leaders. So it seems to me the way out, really,
Yes.
is for the people of South Sudan across the board, whether they are in the government-controlled areas or the rebel-controlled areas, to come together and stop fighting, especially the young people, the youth. So that these are the people that can actually save the country, because they cannot allow the security of their children, the security of their people to depend on the goodwill of leaders when leaders have consistently shown that they lack such goodwill.
Yes, and Gashia, let's talk about one of the issues that Peter has talked about, and that is the international community, the sanctions. There have been, threats of international sanctions, of course, against South Sudan if they don't end the conflict there. Now that we've not received any kind of information today from Addis Ababa, hypothetically speaking, if the talks don't bring a lasting peace, or does it result in any kind of development with regards to peace in South Sudan, do you think international threats, international sanctions will make these two leaders come to the table and, iron out their issues?
One would hope so, but the reality on the ground is that in many instances, the international community, perhaps in the past, has been sending what we call mixed signals, and that they have allowed the two principals and indeed their supporters to kind of play games, for lack of a better term, and that they have sought to delay, to sabotage, to put hurdles along the way. Now, with Eyad, and everybody is perhaps very optimistic that this time round, Eyad, and with the Troika, that is the US, Britain, and Norway, and in that regard with the United Nations, that they would move and make it painful for, indeed, the top leadership in both the government and within the opposition, that they cannot then be business as usual. There have been threats of imposing what we'd call targeted sanctions on individuals, including their families, including travel, and there have been issues of assets recovery and freezing of their bank accounts within the region and internationally. But so far, not much has been seen by way of making the peace in South Sudan and the lack of it painful to the principles. And in this regard, it's both a top leadership within the government and also top leadership within the opposition.
Yes.
As we still are waiting to get what really transpired, what was agreed, if indeed there was any, or whether then they differed in principle, I think you get the feeling that both parties did not want at this particular moment to be perceived and misread by the international community, and in particular Eyad, and subsequently within the African Union and, of course, the larger international community, to be defined, as it were, the international community. So by going to Addis Ababa, it was, in my view, a way of saying, okay, we have met, but then they are buying time. For both parties, they are buying time and perhaps also hoping to escape, as it were, the direct imposition of sanctions, be they financial, military, or even travel. Now, will this stand? I am hoping that possibly the international community will, this time round, perhaps have what I would call a bite.
Yes, we'll wait and see about that, Gashie. Let me engage Peter shortly. And Peter, let me quote this statement very quickly from Madior Garang Mabior, who's the chairman of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. And this is what he said, quote unquote, in his statement on the face-to-face talks between Kiir and Machar. This is what he said: solution should be to revisit the model used to achieve the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, into brackets CPA, I mean, what is this all about? And it seems from this statement, the Mabior team are not like giving this kind of talks in Addis Ababa the goodwill it deserves.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the CPA model is the, if you recall, is the agreement that the Southern Sudan reached with the Sudan government, North-South war in 2005. That agreement had a number of protocols. It had a health sharing protocol. It had a power sharing protocol. It basically kept two armies, one army for the south and one army for the north. The idea really behind it was that the South wanted a guarantee that if it wanted to secede from the unity of Sudan, it could do so while having a military power that can guarantee that secession. When you look at that model compared to the situation going on now, that model is completely unfit as a framework for resolving this conflict. There is no secession. It's not like VP Machar is looking to create his own state. So the ideas like having two armies within the same state or having a wealth-sharing protocol, for example, those kind of things in the CPA were meant to address the development imbalances between the North and the South. In the current context of South Sudan, every region of South Sudan is underdeveloped, and they need development. So that kind of model is completely unfit. The issue here is you have leaders in VP Machar and in Salva Kiir that are basically holding the people of South Sudan hostage. They want to remain in power, and they want power because power gives them access to resources, which they especially loot to keep themselves and their families rich. And they have been doing that for quite some time. But the fundamental issue, these gentlemen are not interested in transformation of South Sudan. They're not really interested in helping the people of South Sudan. So I have no faith whatsoever in the ability to bring change to South Sudan. And in fact, it's important for Eyad to begin to see these two gentlemen as part of a problem instead as part of the solution.
Thank you, Peter, for that. Gashie, very briefly, perhaps could you tell us what's the end game or what the end game should be in this, a conflict that has taken place for so many years now?
Thank you. The end game perhaps will differ depending on whom you speak to and perhaps depending on the principles here. But put it this way. For President Salva Kiir, he and his co-supporters feel that they would, and they are not at the moment willing to share power on the basis that they are a sovereign country, that they are in control of Juba, and that they have the, shall I say, the economic wherewithal in which to do this. Now, but are they willing to concede? They have perhaps not willing to concede the key principal aspect. Riek Machar coming back into Juba as a vice president, be it first or second. The second one and most critical is that they are not willing to share or even discuss what we call security sector reforms, including the military and the military, shall I say, progression. Now, for Riek Machar and his team, they would, and they insist on a power-sharing deal. And as my colleague perhaps was saying, they are basing this on the CPA that was, done in between 2002 and 2005. But there are certain other issues in the periphery. There are, as we speak now, a motley of factions fighting against both the Riek Machar and the government, and these are all within central, western, and eastern Equatoria. There are those that are in the north, and they are not aligned, so to speak, to either of the two bigger factions. Now,
Clearly,
how then to rally and bring in all the different factions together, and which side will they join in? But currently, President Salva Kiir and his core support are not, at the moment, feeling sufficiently threatened in terms of security, despite they losing control of large sections of the country.
Clearly, this is a very complex,
at the moment.
Yes, Geshe, clearly this is a very complex situation.
Yes,
I can see from your explanation there. Many thanks for your input. As always, unfortunately, we are out of time, but many thanks for your input. John Geshe is a regional affairs analyst. And of course, I've been speaking to Peter Bior, who is the founder director of the Center for Strategic Analysis in Juba. Of course, he was talking to us via way of Skype from Berlin, Germany. Many thanks for your input, gentlemen. And that brings us to the end of the first part of this program. But we still have a lot lined up for you, including other stories from other parts of this vast continent. And of course, I'm going to go through some of your comments on our Twitter poll after this very short break. But